Hi everyone, Clev here. Today we are going to start day 4 of chapter 0, which is square roots and simplifying radicals. And today is going to be the last day of chapter 0. What is a radical expression? Well, every radical expression has 3 parts. The first part is the index. The index is just telling you what root you are in. And today we are going to focus on the square roots. The radical is just that symbol. And finally, the radicand. The radicand is the number underneath the radical. Square roots and simplifying radicals. A radical expression is an expression that contains a square root. The expression is in simplest form when the following 3 conditions have been met. 1. No radicands have perfect square factors other than 1. Remember, radicand is just the number under the square root. 2. No radicands contain fractions. And 3. No radicals appear in the denominator of a fraction. The product property states that for 2 numbers, a and b, which both are greater than or equal to 0, if we multiply the square root of a times b, we can actually split up that radical into 2 separate radicals, which would be the square root of a times the square root of b. So once again, these 2 are the same. Before we get into simplifying radicals, let's go over square numbers. Square numbers are going to be our best friends here. So what are our square numbers? They're in red here. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, and so on and so forth. Now, you do not need to memorize all of these, but you should be familiar with majority of them. So if you want to write them down, I would do so. So why are these square numbers important? Well, if we're simplifying radicals, we want to break out these perfect square numbers. So for example, I have the square root of 45. So I want to look at this and say, which perfect square is divisible by 45? If you think about that for a second, we know 9 times 5 is equal to 45. 9 is a perfect square. So if I rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 5, that's still the square root of 45. I just broke it into 2 factors. Well, looking at both of these radicals, which one simplifies? And it's the square root of 9. What is the square root of 9? 3. So 3 radical 5 is the simplified form of the square root of 45. You can actually double check this by plugging it in your calculator. And if you type in the square root of 45, you get 6.708 blah, blah, blah. And if you plug in 3 times the square root of 5, you will get the same decimal. That should always happen. So always double check your answers. B, I have the square root of 6 times the square root of 15. The first thing I'm going to do here is make one big radical. So 6 times 15 is all going to be underneath. Well, what is 6 times 15? That is 90. So I have the square root of 90 that I want to simplify. What perfect square number is divisible by 90? Well, that's 9 times 10. 9 is a perfect square. So if I rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 10, which radical simplifies? And that's the square root of 9. The square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 10 stays as a square root of 10 because that does not simplify. So 3 square root of 10 is my answer. Example 2. Let's simplify the fraction under our radical. which is the square root of 25 divided by 16. From that first slide, it told us that you are not allowed to have fractions inside a radical. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to make the radical in the numerator as well as the denominator. So I just took my original radical, I split it apart, put a radical in the numerator and a radical in the denominator. Now you might see that this is going to simplify pretty easy, because what is the square root of 25? It's 5. What is the square root of 16? It's 4. So 5/4 is going to be my answer. The last problem here, we have radicals in the denominator, and you are not allowed to have that. So I need to figure out how can I get rid of the radical in the denominator. Anytime you multiply by a form of 1, you don't change your problem. So if I want to get rid of the square root of 3 in the denominator, I'm going to want to multiply by the square root of 3 to cancel that radical out. Well, what I do to the denominator, I also have to do to the numerator. So the square root of 3 divided by the square root of 3 is a form of 1, and so you're allowed to multiply by a form of 1 so that the problem does not change. All right, so let's multiply 2 times the square root of 3, and that's 2 times the square root of 3, divided by the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is 3. And if I look, I can't simplify anything else, so this is my answer. We can double check that this is correct by plugging 2 divided by the square root of 3 in our calculator, and by plugging in 2 times the square root of 3 divided by 3, you will get the same decimal. You always want to get the same decimal. Let's move to part B. Just looking at this, I see that I have the square root of 18 in the denominator. Are you allowed to have a radical in the denominator? No. So what am I going to multiply the numerator and denominator by? The square root of 18 times the square root of 18. So let's simplify this now. The numerator is going to be one big radical, 13 times 18 divided by, and what is the square root of 18 times the square root of 18? It's just 18. So let's look at the numerator. Let's look at the numerator, and I'm going to simplify that. So 13 times 18 is 234 divided by 18. Now let's see, does that numerator simplify? All right, so what perfect square is divisible by 234? This might take you a little while because you have to go back to your perfect square numbers and kind of plug and chug, figure out which perfect square. So I'm going to give you a second and see if you can figure that out. All right, so hopefully you got 9 is the perfect square that is divisible by 234. Well, 9 times 26 is equal to 234. So I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 26 divided by 18. 9, the square root of 9 simplifies, and that is 3. Square root of 26 does not simplify, so that's going to stay as the square root of 26. Divide that by 18. Now, this can be your answer. I'd accept that, but we do know that 3 does go into 18. So this is the same as the square root of 26 divided by 6. So either one of these I'd accept as my answer.